Ladies and gentlemen, this short lecture is going to be all about the historical context for Beowulf as a poem. Just give you some background information, fill in some gaps because I doubt a lot of this stuff is known to many of us. It would be unusual if it was. Um, we were talking in the last lecture about how odd and strange Beowulf as a poem. It's not about people like us. The people it talks about are very, very different from how we conceive the world. How much older is this world than the one we're living in now? Well, we're not really sure actually. The poem was written anywhere between 700 AD and 1000 AD, so at least 1,000 years ago, maybe 13 or 1400 years ago. We're not quite sure. We do know 1000 AD is the maximum, is the latest it might have been written, and that's because that is the only Beowulf manuscript that we have in existence. This poem exists in one manuscript only, one, and it's not in good shape. This poem. It's actually in this thing called the Noel Codex, which is named after this 16th century scholar. It was burned in a fire in 1731. So at one point you're gonna look at one of the pages, and there's gonna be some words that are illegible. That's because we don't know what those words are. The one manuscript that we have is damaged by a fire. We almost lost the entire thing. And just the manuscript in general is in bad shape. So we don't know much, if anything, about the historical context of this poem, besides what the poem tells us itself. We don't know who wrote it. There's no author that we know, so we say it's Beowulf by Anonymous. That's all we know. We don't know if it was originally a written poem or if it existed in oral culture for centuries. Actually, we think the latter is probably true. It's definitely true, but we don't know if the actual version that we have in existence was written as is, or if that entire story was oral in nature. We do know that the Anglo-Saxons, from whom we get this manuscript, were interested in wondrous creatures. And that's because the Noel Codex is filled with stories of monsters and wondrous beings and things of that nature. And we kind of think that's why Beowulf got lumped in with all these other things, because Beowulf has a lot of monsters in it. And this entire collection of manuscripts is all about monsters. So going back, at least back to the Anglo-Saxons, good old Anglo-Saxons, they were just as interested in monsters as everybody taking this course. So that's one thing we do know. But if we don't know anything in particular about the historical context of Beowulf as a poem, we do know a whole lot about its audience, the Anglo-Saxons. If you've never heard of the Anglo-Saxons, basically Dark Age is Europe. Not a lot of information is out there. They are located in England, and Beowulf itself as a poem is written in, sometimes it's called Anglo-Saxon language, sometimes it's called Old English. You know Chaucer, he spoke in Middle English. Old English is the older version of that. Modern, middle, old. See how that works. But what you're also going to notice here, you may have noticed it already, is Anglo-Saxons, they live in England. Makes sense. Do any of the events in this poem, happen in England? Not a single one. We have Denmark, we have Scandinavia. So what's going on here? Why is it the case that this poem about Danes and Scandinavians is being told in England? Well, to the best of our knowledge, what happened was there's a lot of English, by the way, is a Germanic language based off of original Germanic languages. And there was a lot of Germanic-speaking peoples, Scandinavia, Denmark, Germany, way back in the day. And what we think is what happens is that when England was being settled by a lot of these Germanic-speaking peoples after the fall of the Roman Empire, people like the Angles and the Saxons, they settled over in England, and they basically brought their stories with them. That's what people do when they move from one place to another. They take their stories with them. And that's how, like, these stories about Scandinavia and Denmark, that's how they made their way to England, thanks to the Angles and the Saxons. By the way, if you don't know where the name England comes from, it's kind of an odd name. Think about the Angles. Here we go, the Angles. Land of the Angles, Angleland, England, natural corruptional language, and that's where the name England actually comes from. And for those of you who happen to be interested in Lord of the Rings, either the books or the films, you actually do know a lot about the Anglo-Saxons already, even if you don't realize it yet. The Rohirrim in Lord of the Rings are based very, very closely on the Anglo-Saxons. Tolkien, as we're going to discover, he was a medievalist, and he got a lot of his source materials for Lord of the Rings from medieval literature, particularly Beowulf. Beowulf was his favorite poem. Now, the Rohirrim aren't exactly like the Anglo-Saxons. The Rohirrim are illiterate, and the Anglo-Saxons, obviously, they have a thriving book culture. They wrote things like Beowulf. Also, the Rohirrim in Lord of the Rings, they ride horses. They're big horse people. There's no cavalry in the Anglo-Saxons. It was all heavy infantry. They did not have cavalry or anything in battle. But that's just a side reference if you happen to be into Lord of the Rings. So we do know stuff about the Anglo-Saxons. We also know that somewhere in the 7th century, they were converted to Christianity. They became a Christian country somewhere between 590 and 660 AD. And this actually is kind of important for how we look at Beowulf as a poem. It doesn't necessarily affect the monsters so much, but it's one of the big debates about this poem is how Christian does it happen to be. On one hand, there's a lot of references to God, and whoever told the story clearly knew some bits about the Bible. There's biblical references here. There's the monster Grendel is descended from the race of Cain. Obviously, Cain was forever cursed because he killed his brother Abel. Technically, he's the first murderer. And so we have stories of Cain and Abel. We have other stories. We have stories of giants and like from David and Goliath. There's a mention of that here. The problem with that is that we do know that there was some biblical knowledge here in Beowulf, so it seems like a Christian poem in some senses, but who was obviously a big and important figure in Christianity. Starts with a J, ends with the Jesus. Jesus. There's no Jesus in this poem. There's no Big JC himself does not appear here. And so people are like, well, that's kind of weird. How Christian can this poem be if there's no Jesus in it? And you find out that the ethics in this poem are definitely not Christian. We talked about, how do you deal with grief? Well, one of the classic New Testament ways of doing it is you turn the other cheek. Somebody does you wrong, you turn the other cheek. You'll get your rewards in heaven. Don't seek revenge. This poem is all about seeking revenge. There's no turning the other cheek. It's to kill the person who wrongs you, and if you can't get to them, just kill their families instead. Start a blood feud, and that's completely okay. So the fact is, on one hand, it seems like a very Christian poem, has these Christian references, mention conversions. They do have one line where it talks about how evil pagan religions are. I think Hrothgar tried to sacrifice at a pagan shrine when he was trying to get rid of Grendel. That did not work whatsoever. However, he didn't call in a priest to get rid of Grendel. He called in a hero, Beowulf, to get rid of him. So still, he was mean to the pagans, the Old Norse religion, like people like Odin, Thor. Those are the pagan people in this particular context. But there's no priest or praying to Jesus or anything else. So it's been one of the running debates in this poem about how Christian it actually happens to be. And it does, in fact, how we interpret the poem. We're not going to worry about that too much. For this course, we want to focus on the monster. And so with the monsters. So without further ado, we'll get to that.